Today in the Daily Dose, the American 1930s. After the high times of the Roaring '20s, by the end of the decade, a confluence of factors led to the stock market crash of late 1929, followed by the Great Depression to follow, including runaway stock speculation, international instability caused by the First World War, and a punishing agricultural slump. During an age before federal oversight or intervention of any kind, as the worst hard time descended upon average Americans, more than 9,000 banks had failed by 1933, depriving many Americans of their savings deposits, while the ranks of the unemployed climbed to 15 million Americans, a full 25% of the total American workforce. Lacking government safety nets, such as unemployment insurance or Social Security benefits for seniors, the consumer economy ground to a deafening halt. In response to the early years of the Great Depression, President Herbert Hoover maintained a hands-off policy that only worsened the nation's plight, believing that crazy and dangerous Wall Street speculators were responsible for the nation's woes. As more and more Americans lost their homes and farms to foreclosures and bank failures, shantytown encampments became known as Hoovervilles, named so as a direct insult to Hoover's laissez-faire response to the national crisis. To make matters worse, the Dust Bowl comprised yet another man-made disaster when farmers in the Plain States overtilled grasslands without planting tree breaks to block prairie winds, forcing 2.5 million Americans to abandon their farms in what became known as the Dirty 30s. Other natural disasters compounded the nation's woes, including the 1935 Category 5 Labor Day hurricane that ravaged the Florida Keys, followed by a second Cat 5 hurricane that tore through New England in 1938. Sweeping the presidential election of 1932, after Franklin D. Roosevelt took office the following year, he implemented his first and second New Deal policies to help a nation retake its feet, in his words, to wage a war against the emergency. Ending Prohibition on December 5, 1933, FDR pushed the Emergency Banking Act through Congress before signing the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, or TVA, which allowed the federal government to build dams along the Tennessee River for flood control and the generation of inexpensive hydroelectric power, followed by the National Industrial Recovery Act. During his second New Deal, FDR steered the Social Security Act through Congress, at the same time creating the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, injecting federally funded jobs for the unemployed, which in turn improved the American infrastructure through the construction of post offices, bridges, schools, highways, and parks. While the 1930s was an undeniably tough time for most Americans, the nation also took time to play as best they could. By 1938, for instance, more than 80% of American households had radios, with such comedy distractions as Amos and Andy, along with soap operas, sporting events, and the news, while the swing era and the jazz age took the nation by storm, with bands such as Benny Goodman, Fletcher Henderson, Count Basie, and Duke Ellington. Cocktail lounges and bar rooms flourished after the days of illegal speakeasies, while Hollywood entered its golden age with films like The Wizard of Oz, It's a Wonderful Life, and Casablanca. By the end of the decade, as the winds of war escalated, even before Adolf Hitler's 1939 invasion of Poland, American industrial might ramped up to produce the weapons of 20th century mechanized warfare, which in turn raised the nation out of depression during the 1940s and beyond, making the American 1930s a time of trial and tribulation for Americans everywhere. And there you have it, the American 1930s, today in the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. the birth of gospel. Beginning in the 16th century, when transatlantic slave traders brutally kidnapped an estimated 12 to 15 million Africans into the Americas, losing an average 10 to 19% each voyage due to the disease-ridden and inhumane conditions aboard Middle Passage slave ships. When slavers noticed their cargoes singing in the cramped confines of their holds, they allowed it due to the calming effect it had on newly enslaved people. New musical traditions were to follow during the oppressive slave years to come, drawing on the most sacred black music of West Africa, which eventually morphed into the pentatonic scales of the blues, allowing black slaves to voice their misery and subtle protest against their white oppressors. During the Great Migration of 1915 to 1970, when blacks escaped the Jim Crow laws of the segregated South, Chicago became a destination promised land for many blacks between 1915 to 1940, when the city more than doubled its black population in neighborhoods such as Bronzeville, including Thomas Andrew Dorsey, a 17-year-old musician and recent graduate from Atlanta Baptist College, now known as Morehouse, who migrated from Villa Rica, Georgia, with high aspirations of becoming a professional musician, finding early success with blues singer Ma Rainey, followed by his then scandalous song with Hudson Tampa-Red Whitaker, "It's Tight Like That." Dorsey suffered a nervous breakdown following the death of a friend in the mid-1920s, prompting him to write "If You See My Savior," which infused elements of the blues into his somber spiritual tune, leading to the creation of what he called gospel blues. Despite early pushback from black ministers given its bluesy, sinful origins, Dorsey co-founded the National Convention of Gospel Choirs and Choruses, soon sharing his music with groups of women vocalists and congregations around the country, including a young singer named Mahalia Jackson, now recognized as one of the greatest gospel singers of all time. In 1931, after Dr. Junius C. Austin invited Dorsey to organize a gospel choir in his Pilgrim Baptist Church, gospel music soon spread around the nation due to the rising prevalence of radios in the American home. Today, gospel remains an important spiritual aspect of many congregations around the country, making the gospel blues an honored grandchild of the musical salvations of slavery. The Hawthorne Effect. Back in the 1920s, 40,000 employees at Western Electric Hawthorne Works in Cicero, Illinois, produced a steady output of telephone equipment in what was considered a much-coveted job in the immigrant-rich suburb of Chicago. Beginning in 1924 and lasting for the next 3 years, the National Academy of Sciences began a study at Hawthorne and 3 other locations with the intent of determining the impact of better illumination on productivity, efficiency, and worker morale. Researchers quickly reported a marked increase in all 3 parameters, not only in the areas where lighting was improved, but also in unstudied, unenhanced areas of the plant. Even more confounding, productivity and efficiency continued to remain elevated even when the improved lighting was turned down or even shut off entirely. Calling their results inconclusive and flawed, the studies were canceled by the National Academy until Western Electric and Harvard University revived the study in 1928, originally focusing their efforts on 6 young women working the relay line, which became the first industry-based scientific study to examine employee attitudes and their relationship to productivity and worker morale. Changes to scheduling, work breaks, and manufacturing processes were freely discussed with the focus group, whose output and involvement in their work increased dramatically, reflecting a robust elevation of worker performance under increased interaction and engagement by management. Each completed relay was counted by a ticker tape, which recorded an overall increase in productivity of 30%. Under the direction of Harvard psychologist and industrial researcher Elton Mayo, the study continued until 1932, moving into production areas throughout the Hawthorne facility, where some 20,000 workers were interviewed about their jobs, their supervisors, their work environments, and even their personal lives, making the Hawthorne studies the first ever employee interview program anywhere in the industrialized world. Coined the Hawthorne effect by Henry A. Landsberger in 1958, and later criticized by researchers for lacking control groups, the first of its kind study revealed how worker productivity improved when workers were exposed to increased attention by management, making the Hawthorne effect a major leap forward in corporate human relations. The American 1940s. In a decade soon overshadowed by the Second World War, Americans looked on in horror when Nazi stormtroopers invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. And while the nation had strongly favored isolationist policies since the end of the First World War, after Hitler's invasion of the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France in mid-1940, on June 3rd of that same year, President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the sale of surplus U.S. war material to Great Britain, followed by the congressional enactment of the first peacetime conscription draft in the fall of 1940. Less than 3 months later, America entered World War II after Japan's unprovoked attack on American naval assets at Pearl Harbor. In response, American industrial might pivoted from producing consumer goods from cars to televisions to building weapons vital to the Allies' war efforts, inspiring a national economic boom after the hardscrabble years of the Great Depression. With so many men fighting in Europe and the Pacific, women collectively known as Rosie the Riveter responded en masse to fill the labor vacuum, building weapons of war that would ultimately lead to a high-priced victory over Axis aggression. After Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945, just months after FDR's sudden death from a cerebral hemorrhage, young men returned home weary of war and adventure, with a common desire to settle down into family life with their sweethearts, kicking off the American baby boom, which would last well into the 1960s. As Cold War tensions began to escalate in 1947, Americans learned to live under the anxiety-producing threat of mutually assured nuclear destruction, as the U.S. funded numerous proxy wars against the Soviet Union under a burning desire to halt the spread of communism. Television soon replaced the radio as a nation's preferred form of entertainment, ushering in such popular shows as Candid Camera, Howdy Doody, Kraft Television Theater, and The Lone Ranger, while Hollywood ruled the box office with hits like Citizen Kane, The Quiet One, and a literal conga line of movies spawned by the Second World War. Swing remained a dominant mainstay on the American music scene, led by musicians such as Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, Frank Sinatra, and Artie Shaw, making the American 1940s a time of sacrifice and renewal after a decade of crushing deprivation. The American 1950s. After the hardscrabble days of the Great Depression, America's all-in can-do commitment to winning the war against tyranny brought about a time of booming prosperity, prompting former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to proclaim that America at this moment stands at the summit of the world. Soldiers who would survive World War II returned home weary of adventure, with a unified desire to settle down into family life with their sweethearts, igniting a baby boom in the 1950s that recorded roughly 4 million births each and every year. the post-war economy boomed as well, kicking off a golden age of American capitalism that saw the doubling of America's gross national product from 1946 to 1960, flooding a burgeoning middle class with consumer goods and revolutionary home appliances like never before. Fueled by low-cost mortgages backed by the GI Bill, young couples flocked to new tract suburbs built by developers such as William Levitt, collectively earning the nicknames Fertility Valley and the Rabbit Hutch in light of the ongoing baby boom. The decade also witnessed a steady rise in Cold War tensions as Americans fretted over the perceived spread of communism by one-time war ally the Soviet Union, leading to the rise of McCarthyism and the Red Scare of the 1950s, which prompted Congress to hold 84 hearings on un-American activities from 1945 and 1952. No one was immune from congressional scrutiny, including federal workers, university professors, Hollywood, and the military, in the end failing to uncover much treasonous activity, yet causing tens of thousands of Americans to lose their jobs, families, and friends. Civil rights also came into focus when the Supreme Court's 1954 Brown v. Board of Education declared that separate educational facilities for blacks and whites was inherently unequal, leading 100 Southern congressmen to sign the Southern Manifesto 2 years later, affirming their staunch defense of Jim Crow laws and racial segregation in the South. In December of 1955, Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat on a city bus for a white person, igniting a 13-month boycott by Montgomery, Alabama blacks after Parks was arrested for her show of nonviolent resistance. The decade also saw the birth of rock and roll, as a new sound swept the nation by music icons such as Elvis Presley, Sam Cooke, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, and Fats Domino. Young people danced to the Platters and the Drifters, while musicians like Jerry Lee Lewis pioneered the rockabilly sound. Known as the Day the Music Died, on February 3, 1954, a nation mourned the tragic loss of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. Richardson, taken in their prime by a plane crash over Clear Lake, Iowa. Television and Hollywood movies also shared the limelight, witnessing the golden age of television as more and more Americans could afford such technological luxuries, along with enough leisure time and money to escape into the world of Hollywood movies. Shows like The Honeymooners, I Love Lucy, and Leave It to Beaver kept families glued to their TV sets, while movie icons such as John Wayne, Elizabeth Taylor, Dean Martin, and Marilyn Monroe swooned the hearts of American moviegoers, making the 1950s a vital gateway for the 60s and beyond. The Hollywood 10. Beginning in the late 1940s and continuing through most of the 1950s, the House Un-American Activities Committee, led by such anti-communist notables as Joseph McCarthy, was seated to investigate allegations of communist subversion in the U.S. during the opening years of the Cold War. The committee aimed much of its focus on the Hollywood film industry, which was known for communist sympathies during the hardscrabble years of the Great Depression, leading committee members to believe that lingering communist support in the industry could become the birthing ground for subversive propaganda weaved into the storyline of American movies. Although little evidence exists of a socialist agenda in Hollywood films of the time, 40 Hollywood writers, directors, and actors were subpoenaed to appear before the committee, and while the majority sought career-saving leniency through cooperation, 10 writers and directors openly challenged the committee's basic intentions behind their witch hunt investigations. Not only did the men refuse to cooperate with the committee's hearings, but they openly denounced the proceedings as a sacred violation of their First Amendment rights, which gives all Americans the right to support any political party or ideology of their choosing. "I am not on trial here," screenwriter John Howard Lawson testified in the House chamber. "This committee is on trial." The Hollywood 10 would pay dearly for their belligerence when each was tried for contempt of Congress. All 10 were sentenced to a year in prison and fined $1,000, while Edward Dmytryk eventually turned government witness, pointing the finger at 20 Hollywood colleagues he claimed to have affiliations with the Communist Party. Fearing that radical politics would turn the movie-going public against Hollywood films, studio executives blacklisted the Hollywood 10, with the exception of Dmytryk, promising the House Un-American Activities Committee that no person with communist affiliations would ever again find employment in the industry. That said, many of the Hollywood 10 writers continued to produce screenplays for Hollywood films under pseudonyms, including Dalton Trumbo, who wrote The Brave One under the pen name Robert Rich, which earned him an Academy Award in 1957 for Best Screenplay. The Hollywood Red Scare and Blacklist would continue to expand throughout the 1950s, finally losing focus with the advent of the 1960s. A shaky grand opening for the happiest place on earth. Disneyland was the result of Walt Disney's vision to make a theme park that captured the illusionary wonders found in his movies, as well as a place where parents could have just as much fun as their children. Disney started planning his park in the 1940s, while his overriding theme had morphed several times before construction began in 1954. Originally, Disneyland was to be called Mickey Mouse Park, and if he had kept that vision for a mouse-centric experience, his final product would have been drastically different than the Disneyland we've come to know. Despite his evolving concepts for the park, in Disney's mind anyway, Disneyland had to be totally perfect, including no potential glimpses at buildings in the surrounding city of Anaheim that existed outside his theme park. In other words, Disney insisted that nothing should be allowed to break the magic and illusionary wonder he had set out to create. Disneyland opened on July 17, 1955, exactly 1 year and a day after construction first began. Opening day guests were by invitation only, including celebrities, members of the press, friends, family, and Disney VIPs. There was a total of around 11,000 invited guests, but the invitations themselves soon leaked to the outside world. Counterfeit tickets were sold illegally, and one man even set up a ladder and charged $5 a person for desperate would-be parkgoers to scale the fence. Over 28,000 people entered Disneyland that day, a number that both Disneyland and the city of Anaheim were completely unprepared for. Traffic was backed up for several miles outside the park, and the Disney parking lot soon reached capacity. Problems were magnified when a plumber strike turned off all the water to every drinking fountain on the unusually hot 100-plus degree day, while every Disneyland restaurant ran out of food and drinks within hours. The heat also made the freshly laid masonry asphalt turn spongy, making walking particularly treacherous for women in high heels. Several of the rides malfunctioned, and a gas leak prompted Adventureland, Frontierland, and Fantasyland to be evacuated. Despite these opening day glitches, Disneyland would open to the general public the following day, welcoming upwards of 50,000 visitors into the park, who had begun amassing at the main gates as early as 2 a.m. in the morning. Within its first 2 months of operations, Disneyland proved to be an overwhelming success, welcoming more than 1 million visitors to the happiest place on earth.
We've made a bum out of Barnum today, but we've got to go.
I know, but I just want to say a word of thanks to all the artists, the workers, and everybody that helped make this dream come true.
Let's go into Fantasyland and have some fun.
Let's go.
Goodbye, folks.
Dwight D. Eisenhower. Born in 1890 Denison, Texas, Dwight D. Eisenhower grew up in a poor family in Abilene, Kansas, before attending West Point despite his mother's pacifist objections. After marrying Mamie Geneva Dowd in 1916, Eisenhower served as a military aide to General John J. Pershing during World War I, followed by General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines from 1935 to 1939, until General George C. Marshall called him to Washington to spearhead the successful Allied invasion of North Africa during World War II, followed by the amphibious invasion of Sicily and the Italian mainland in 1943. In late 1943, Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe, where his astute leadership called for air supremacy over the German Luftwaffe, which then led to the June 6, 1944 D-Day invasion of 5 beaches in Normandy, France, when 150,000 Allied troops crossed the English Channel before fighting their way to the liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, followed by VE Day on May 8, 1945. World War II ended after nuclear detonations over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, despite Eisenhower's adamant objection to the use of nuclear weapons on a Japanese nation clearly on the brink of surrender. Returning home to a hero's welcome, Eisenhower served a short stint as president of Columbia University, until President Harry S. Truman tapped him out to command the newly formed North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1950, intended to combat communist aggression abroad. Winning the White House with running mate Richard M. Nixon in 1953, Eisenhower's 2 terms in office witnessed numerous legislative victories, despite a Democratic majority in Congress, 6 out of his 8 years in office, leading to the creation of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, a strengthened Social Security Administration, and the passage of the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956, which led to the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways across the nation. He also signed an armistice ending the Korean War, while deciding against an airstrike to rescue French troops from imminent defeat at Dien Bien Phu, Vietnam, leaving office with a stern yet largely overlooked warning against an escalating military-industrial complex during the peak years of the Cold War. He passed away from congestive heart failure at Walter Reed Army Medical Center on March 28, 1969, ending the life of one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. United Airlines Flight 629. On November 1, 1955, United Airlines Flight 629, also known as the mainliner Denver, boarded 39 passengers and 5 crew members for its scheduled flight from Denver Stapleton Field for stops in Portland and Seattle. At 7:03 p.m., less than 11 minutes into the flight, controllers at Stapleton lost the flight from their radar scopes, noting a large bright flash in the distant night sky, somewhere over Longmont, Colorado. When investigators arrived at the scene of the crash, no survivors could be found amongst the strewn wreckage. One of the deceased passengers was Daisy Graham, and within days, investigators arrested her son, John Gilbert Graham, for the mass murder of the passengers and crew of Flight 629. By planting a dynamite time bomb in his mother's checked luggage, John Graham was hoping to cash in on a life insurance policy he had purchased in the airport terminal just prior to his mother's departure. The face value of the policy was a mere $37,500, which in today's money would equal around $360,000, the going price, it seemed, for the lives of 44 innocent victims. As the backstory unfolded, investigators would learn that John's mother, Daisy, had given him up for adoption when her second husband and John's father died from pneumonia. Daisy's third husband died shortly after their marriage began, allowing the widow to open a successful restaurant when she inherited his money. While Daisy never made any attempts to collect her abandoned son from the orphanage, John and his mother reunited when he was 22 years old. In 1955, the same year as the plane crash, a suspicious gas explosion burned Daisy's restaurant to the ground, leading investigators to discover that John Graham had pocketed that insurance money as well. 18 months after the downing of Flight 629, John Gilbert Graham would be executed for the mass murder of all those aboard the ill-fated flight. James Dean. Born in 1931 Marion, Indiana, after dropping out of UCLA's theater program, James Dean made his first television appearance in a Pepsi commercial, while his initial roles on the big screen came first with an uncredited appearance in 1951's Fixed Bayonets, followed a year later by Sailor Beware, which was a comedy starring Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin. Still an unknown and quite starving actor in greater Los Angeles, Dean worked as a parking lot attendant at CBS Studios, where he met radio director Roger Brackett, who would become one of Dean's most influential mentors in Hollywood. Moving to New York City in 1951, Dean studied under Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio, before finding success in such 1950s television shows as Kraft Television Theater, Omnibus, and General Electric Theater. Dean's ascendancy to cultural icon came with the 1955 film adaptation of John Steinbeck's novel East of Eden, where many of his most recognizable scenes were unscripted improvisations, which would later make him the first actor in Academy Awards history to receive a posthumous Oscar nomination. Later that same year, Dean starred as an agonized teenager in Rebel Without a Cause, a role that would galvanize his image in 1950s American culture. He also starred alongside Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson in the 1956 release of Giant, which was a multi-generational family saga based in early 20th century Texas. Dean's life came to a tragic and premature end on September 30th, 1955, when the budding race car driver and his mechanic, Rolf Woolderidge, traveled in Dean's new Porsche 550 Spider to a race in Salinas, California. After receiving a speeding ticket during a stop in Bakersfield, Dean collided head-on with 23-year-old Cal Poly student Donald Turnipseed, and while Turnipseed and Woolderidge survived, James Dean was killed on impact. The following year, Dean was nominated for his second posthumous Oscar for his role in Giant, the only actor in Academy history to receive 2 posthumous nominations, making the life and works of James Dean a cultural standout in 1950s America. The National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956. In 1956, there were 65 million cars on American highways, with a forecast of 90 million by 1975. Clearly, it was time for national action. Congress responded by passing the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act, which President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed into law on June 29, 1956, kicking off what would become the largest public works project in American history up to its time. The act provided a staggering sum of $51 billion to be spent by the states to build the interstate highway system by 1971, putting in place a 41,000-mile highway system that would change the nation's core freight transportation system from rail-based to truck-based, while allowing Americans the freedom to wander the country like never before. Once the economic hardships of World War II had ended, the United States enjoyed a period of economic prosperity that spanned the 1950s and 60s, which allowed Congress to fund the interstate highway system by diverting defense funding into building highways, thinly rationalized as a vital link between Air Force bases scattered around the country. 90% of interstate construction cost was funded by the federal government, while each state was required to pony up the remaining 10% through new taxes on fuel, automobiles, trucks, and tires. Comprised of a system of controlled access highways, even-numbered interstates travel east to west, with lower-numbered interstates traversing the southern and southwestern states, while the higher-numbered highways traverse the northern states of the country. Odd-numbered interstates travel north to south, with the lower-numbered interstates on the west coast, while the higher-numbered interstates traverse the east coast. Today, the American interstate highway system has grown only slightly since its first conception, providing a total of 46,876 miles for citizens and visitors alike to wander the American landscape. The American baby boom. Like many industrialized Western nations, in the early 20th century, the United States experienced a gradual decline in its birth rate as more Americans moved off farms and into cities. Following victory in World War II, the United States experienced an explosion in its birth rate, adding on average 4.24 million new babies to the population every year between 1946 and 1964. Known as baby boomers, the steady rise in youthful population was the result of a strong post-war economy, allowing American families to feel confident that they could support a larger number of children. Boomers also influenced the economy as a core marketing demographic for products tied to their age group, from toys to records. After 15 years of economic uncertainty brought about by the Great Depression, followed by the economic drain caused by 4 years of American involvement in the war, soldiers who had survived World War II returned home weary of adventure, with a unified desire to settle down into family life with their sweethearts. Combined with educational benefits provided by the GI Bill, access to good jobs and affordable housing, the boom was on almost the moment GIs hit American soil. While some couples rushed to wed and conceive children before soldiers shipped out to war, the real spike in marriages occurred after the war, when 2.2 million couples tied the knot in 1946 alone. With marriage came babies, and by the end of that same year, over 350,000 had been born. By the end of the 18-year-long baby boom period, 76.4 million lives had been added to the American landscape, constituting 40% of the population, which at the time stood at around 192 million. When baby boomers came of age in the 1960s and early 1970s, they began to question norms and values of their parents' generation, including an unjust war in Southeast Asia, civil rights for African Americans, and gender equality for women. The free love hippie movement joined hands with the psychedelic drug movement, fueled by Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters on the West Coast, while Timothy Leary became the acid guru on the East Coast of America. After Les Paul invented the electric guitar, amplified rock and roll ran in direct conflict with the gentle dance tunes favored by the wartime parents of the baby boom generation. Today, now that boomers have in effect become their parents, an estimated 73 million baby boomers have reached or are approaching retirement age, placing added stressors on the nation's Social Security pension system, healthcare costs, and senior living expenses, making baby boomers the largest gray wave in American history.